Welcome to Inside AI. It's our unfiltered insights from the people shaping the AI programs that are actually happening and matter. My name is Jan Esman. I'm the head of strategy for CTO Consulting. And today I've got Jeroen Bulliet, who is the head of innovation and AI at Australian Government Department of Health, Disability and Aging. Let me say before we get started that any opinions, any thoughts you hear here are the sole responsibility of Jan and Jeroen. These are ours, not our organizations or our or the agencies we work with. So it's all our thinking, and I guess that's the benefit. So today we wanted to explore a bit about the agentic AI. So let's have a look at what's happening in the world. And it's not about exploring the dangers or the governance. It's more about looking at the underlying frameworks and what is changing. What are the goals and how will the goals start to shape us? Because agentic AI has a different flavor from traditional IT development in that it is now, it by its very name, it's agentic. It has agency, and it will start to shape the way in which we engage with agentic AI. So the word gets thrown around a lot. Jerome, what does it actually mean in practical terms for running an AI business today?
I think when you look at agentic, it's a perfect marketing word. It's like AI 3 years ago. Everyone suddenly had an AI module, and I think as of last year, everyone has an agentic system. Hence, there's lots of definitions of agentic. So why don't we start with the difference between kind of the world where we came from, which is the chat interface. I prompt it or I just ask it a question, then it comes up with an answer, right? I think that is kind of
Yeah.
common knowledge for most people. It's within organizations, a lot of staff can use this. And then suddenly this concept of agentic comes up, and it seems to be something different. And people have a lot of questions around it. So I think the first thing that's different in people's mind when they call it agentic is it takes action. That's not necessarily the common definition, but I do see people using agentic as in it's beyond chat. I think that's what they mean by it, right? I ask it to do something, it actually executes it, and then it tells me about the result, or I can see the result in an Excel spreadsheet, or it does some programming, those type of things. So it takes action, but it clearly goes further than that, because you say it's by the word agentic itself, it has a certain form of autonomy, meaning it can make certain decisions. Because even when and I think that therefore goes beyond taking action, right? You could say, I ask it to do something, it executes. That's not a decision, it's an execution piece. But I think when you go into agentic, which is you give it some form of autonomy, therefore you give it some level of decision rights, that I think is where it's getting really interesting. And then when you push it a bit further in the innovation space, you can say, well, there's this concept of agents, right? The way you execute things. Then you have groups of agents. Then it's possible that agents create new agents. So now we don't only have function, but we have function with autonomy and therefore decision rights in a concept that didn't even exist. And more, the models have kind of an awareness of itself. So it's not too far in the future, and I've seen people do it, where agents can more or less change itself or the team it is part of. And if you live in that kind of future where there is groups of functions that can interact with each other with decision rights, both within its agents, but also as groups of agents, if we do mean that by agentic, I think that's quite a completely different world than I ask it to do an action on my behalf.
And isn't that fascinating? Because we're not just talking about programming, and we're not talking about traditional thinking about get a use case, develop it, test it, run it, see if it actually makes a benefit. We're almost talking about technology organization design. We've got a lead agent, we've got sub agents, we do resource planning in real life with people, but agents will have to do their resource planning. I need more testing agents to test the product so I can spin up new agents to actually go and do it. So a lot of the organizational design questions that we face with people in organization become true of AI. But take us a little bit more into that? Why don't traditional life cycles work in an AI world?
Well, so partly because what you just said, which is if you give it autonomy and decision rights, that is not too dissimilar to what you ask people to do. They have a certain level of autonomy with certain decision rights.
Mhm.
I think it goes one step further though than where we were, I don't know, 6 to 12 months ago, where we have a coordination agents that can do certain things and brings it back up. Right? The way you manage agentic teams. Um,
Mm.
what if you combine agentic with like the concept of edge AI, right? So AI within certain machinery, for instance, or it doesn't always needs to reach out to an LLM or another type of model, so it doesn't need an internet connection. What if you merge agentic with clear with robotics or drones or the wearables that a number of companies are working on, where right, the glasses are probably something everyone has seen over the last 6 to 9 months, but a number of companies are using wearables that you might literally wear that has
Mm.
maybe one or multiple sensors, including visionary, including sound. If you combine that edge AI with wearables, with autonomous systems or groups of almost like behaviors, if you will, I think you're a lot closer to sociology than you are to organizational design, and you're very far away from traditional IT development.
And underpinning that is the ability for those agents to make decisions, whether it's against data coming from wearables or drones, or it's organizational data associated with risk or thresholds being let. We're asking them to become more autonomous. Therefore, we're asking them to make decisions up to a certain threshold. So, what does that actually look like? What kind of decisions are we asking AI to make?
I think in the future, I'm not sure if it's around what do we ask AI in terms of decision making. I actually think we need to see it in a different level. And this is by far, this is not kind of maybe common understanding, or maybe it's too far in the future, but it's the same as saying we focus on individuals within an organization. If I've defined all the one individual at the time what their decision rights are and how they play together, therefore I've defined the organization. Um, I think organizations have a different construct, which is there's a reason why the organization is together with a certain outcome, strategy, etc., 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 as well as a certain culture that we all
Mm,
know is kind of important where people live in,
mm,
but the culture is not a set of rules, as in defined in coding terms, but it is kind
mhm.
of a set of rules, but they're harder to define. But I would argue that a concept of culture or sociology or how people work together is actually a key control set on what groups of people do and don't do.
And I get really sharp when people mention the culture word because
Mm,
it tends to be one of these nebulous things that are hard to get your hands around. I'm really clear about this. It's a consistent pattern of behavior that people can rely on. Vegemite is Vegemite because it's always black and salty, right? So it's a consistent pattern that you understand, and it goes with the brand promise, and the culture is aligned to the brand and the services outcomes that you expect. So we almost now need to get our AIs to also, I wouldn't say understand, but certainly behave consistent with that culture.
e- Exactly. So to me, culture is also around. It's about observable behaviors, right? That is what you see, and I think then therefore
Hmm.
that is a good definition of culture, or a very
Yeah.
practical definition of culture. Um, if you follow that logic through in a more agentic system, then it is therefore the behavior of an agent or a group of agents that you might want to control or define. And I
Mm.
think that's what a lot of people call, right? Most people have the concept of human in the loop, which is on a kind of agent level or instruction level. I know there's a
Yeah.
term that's just human on the loop. I'm not quite sure what that specifically means. It could mean lots of different things, but in my view, it's like this. It's if you
Mm.
could define observable behavior, let's define that as culture, but that is really practically what it is. Could we in
Hmm.
the future design control systems or frameworks, because we're going to talk about frameworks, can we define frameworks that enable that to happen? But
Yep.
that is quite far away from the frameworks we currently have.
So talk about, I mean, a couple of times you've mentioned in the future we will, or in far away we
Mm.
might have. What's happening right now in terms of, delegating decision making to agents, and how is that being aligned with culture or observable behaviors?
Look, I think it's an emerging field for any organization.
Yeah.
To me, we're in the stage we moved away from I have a chat function, I'll ask it to do things and come back with things, and people will start keep using it, right? In this is my email, make it better, da, 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 come back. That we're beyond that, I think, but that's kind of common good. I think the next thing when you look at government is human decides, AI helps.
Mm.
So, which is different than chat, which is, I know that's AI helps, but it's not really helping other than just an instruction and gives me something back, right?
Yeah.
So I know there's a number of things in lots of probably departments, and when you look at Singapore government and others, where there's
Mm.
ideas and tests around what if I have an agent or a group of agents that can help me with, et cetera, et cetera, et
Mm.
cetera. Design of policy, ministerial briefings, uh, development of code, testing, um,
Mm.
design. You can just fill it in as kind of key functions, but it's still an assistant. And I think a lot of agents are positioned as assistants, which is absolutely
And
true.
uh, and you mentioned, an assistant or an agent or group of agents, and it's the emergent, you know, I guess, pattern that we are going to have hierarchies of agents almost, invariably, because we break up problems the same way as human break up. You can't expect one agent to do all things in a full life cycle. There'll be some doing discovery, there'll be some doing development, there'll be some doing testing. And that's even at a high level. I'm sure it's even further broken down. But what are the gaps? What are the risks in this multi-agent world, and why does it matter?
I think the first risk is, and maybe it's irrelevant, but the end user will not know if it deals with one agent or a group of agents and where it will go because it's
And
the
does that
interface.
matter? That's a good question.
And well, and the
Yeah.
question is that a relevant thing or not that you don't know?
Mm.
If I use Word, I don't know exactly what happens in the back end of Word. Does it
Yeah.
matter? Well, at the moment, it doesn't. Well, we've defined that it doesn't matter because I trust Word as an application, which I think that's kind of how we might want to look at it as well. Because at the moment, because we're so in the technology, we go, hang on, tell me, is it one agent, six agents? What's the coordination doing? How does it all work? But I think, do end users actually truly care? I don't think so.
Mm.
Should they care? Ideally not. The question is, how do you get there?
And it is exactly the same. And I keep making those organizational design sort of, analogies because in my mind, it's exactly the same problem as when I've got a large team structure and somewhere there's a breakdown. There's a team member that doesn't actually get it or, goes off on a slight tangent or covers over errors. And we know that AI seeks to please, so is not always completely transparent about, potential error states that it doesn't want to report. And that it's almost the same kind of problem, isn't it? It's almost like, how do you create the quality assurance and governance controls that give you the confidence that your primary interface agent is actually running a team that's doing its job?
Exactly. So I think end user doesn't necessarily need to care, but people
Yeah.
responsible for the behavior of the agent or agents or the application, because it's just an
Yeah.
application, they definitely care. The question is, how do you manage it? And I think
Mm.
there's emerging software and thinking that
Yep.
initially you'll see the platform providers having controls within their platform.
Yeah.
Um, but if you are a large organization, you have multiple platforms and you have hundreds of applications, and each application has an AI system in it or multiple AI
Yeah.
systems in the future. So my hypothesis is saying is if you work on an application level, even on a platform level, that's
Mm.
helpful but potentially not sufficient. I'll
Yeah.
give you an example in the far future, or maybe not that far future, where um, let's
Our
say
far
a number
futures
of
tend to come at us rather quickly at the moment, don't
well,
they?
we can probably build it in 3 to 6 months, but not on an
Yeah.
enterprise scale, right? So multiple departments, whether it's services, health, et cetera, they all have agents. Let's just assume we all have
Yeah.
agents. Um, then the citizen has a need. I think in the farther future, the citizen might also be represented by an agent or a number of agents. That's already happening with very technical people, right? Then
Yeah.
that agent or group of agents expresses the need to the government its swarm of agents. However that's going to work, I would assume that the agents would reconfigure and coordinate themselves in the most optimal way. Those
Yeah.
agents don't necessarily care which department they belong to, and maybe
Yeah.
they don't need to either. They will reassemble the most optimum answer and provide it back to the agent that represents the citizen. In that
This is,
future,
yeah.
it's a very different world of how you would govern that than traditional software development and application management.
And implied in that message of yours there, Joan, is that you see a world where we won't always choose the agent. Sometimes the agent will choose the right person. The agents will choose us to interact with. You see a world where agents, seek to get the best outcome by actually choosing the departments or the different people to work with to get to the business objective.
Yeah, and technically you can already do it, right? Agents can discover
Mm.
other agents using a handful of protocols.
Yeah.
Little clunky at the moment, but it works. So we can go across platform, if you will, or whatever the boundary is through the different protocols, and you can discover other agents in its environment. So that's not
Mm.
that exotic, but also from a user experience, if, as for instance, government, we can anticipate needs and service it, isn't that a good service? Why wait for a
Yeah.
citizen to go, I need this? Why not going, in 3 months' time, you need this, let me get it sorted for you. Are you okay if I do that for you? Yes, no, let's go. Right? That's not
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a negative or a technical thing. I think that's almost like a
No.
desirable thing. The question is, how do you manage that?
Well, and completely. As the AI experience becomes more human centered, we go from programs which you type in A, you get B, to anticipation of needs and pre-organization of actually, I see a pattern which will need the next service that you will need will be this, this, and this. And I think agencies have been working for some time, life path type discussions. Oh, you've had a baby. You'll probably need to have baby health services. You'll need to have support. You'll need to go and buy new things from the stores. And those things, if you do them programmatically, it becomes very rigid. If you do it more, organically out of, data available, then there's a lot more flexibility. And that's probably the next phase, isn't it?
Well, I think that's what AI gives us as an opportunity, and why
Mm.
we haven't done it 5 or 10 years ago. Because in normal
Yeah.
computer language, it is more rules based. Therefore, it was really hard to anticipate some of these things. But with
Yeah.
AI, its models, Gen AI as a way, a multimodal, etc., etc. Um, there's a lot more opportunity to actually predict with a level of accuracy that actually is useful to people.
It, that kind of speaks to and links to the idea of trust, building trust. Is it a technical problem or an organizational one? And I'll give you an example in my mind. When the self-driving cars have started to appear on US streets, the level of tolerance for an action or a bad outcome was way very much lower than it is for human beings. We have accidents, we bump into things, bad things happen, and but we go like, well, they were looking at their phone, or they weren't or they had a bad day. But our expectation is that we would not allow a machine that level of flexibility. Our level of trust needs to be way higher, that the outcome will be exactly right every time. How does that get built in? Is that a organizational problem, an AI problem, a data problem? Where is that? Where's that happening?
Um, I think so. So just to go back to analogy, I think the
Mm.
level of trust will be a lot higher depending on the the, the urgency of the need. So let me explain. So in the example you gave with a car, the need for cars that drive themselves is there, but it's not incredibly urgent because I already have a way to go from A to B, and I'm very used to it. If I can just make a little bit of a jump, if I need Inceptor drones because people shoot missiles my way, then the need is significantly higher. Therefore, the percentage of accuracy is probably lower before I accept it or trust it, or at least use it. Because trust is just is a way of saying I'm going to use it or not use it. So I think that there's a need driver or urgency driver
Mm,
underlying, but in most situations it's not super urgent. Therefore, you need a
mm,
very high level of trust. And I think in kind of a sales analogy, saying is if you want to sell something, it needs to either have 10 times the benefit or one times the risk. Meaning the risk, how people perceive the risk, is a lot stronger than the upside. So you need to
yeah,
have significant upside, or you need to really just manage the risk almost to zero. So it's only upside. I think that is, but that's a sociology concept, right? That has nothing to do
it
with
is.
technology. It's just the way we experience the world, probably.
Completely. And I do think with the car driving, I take your point, but the consequences of a bad action are very high. A kid gets run over on the way to school. It can be devastating already, some of the scenarios that have happened. So in that case, we build a different trust system for mechanical systems than we do have for human-based systems. And I think that's probably a whole, podcast, in itself to explore what that actually looks like, because it's a sociological problem, organizational problem. And I think that's a good categorization, though. If I'm thinking of projects that I want to run on AI in my business right now, I'd be looking for things that matter, and the risk associated with those as a good sort of checkpoint about where that was going. Um, going back to the organization, and thinking about the frameworks around doing AI projects, is it where is it going to happen? Is it going to happen at a department level or a national level? And what are the regulatory frameworks and shared infrastructure which is going to enable more AI experimentation?
So depends on the level of agentic you're using. I think would be the answer. So if you
Mm,
go from, so do the frameworks work in kind of the chat prompting interface? Yes, right. There's lots of frameworks, there's lots of controls, but more importantly, there's enough understanding and capability and capacity to manage that style of system. If
yeah.
you move towards kind of the next step up, which is AI assisted, right? So
Yep.
it does take actions, those type of things. Frameworks are very much kind of emerging. For instance, Singapore government has just released an agentic framework, just as in end of January at the World Economic Forum. And it's a very
Mm,
good framework. It reads really well. There's a trust guide with it. The
yep.
trust guide itself is 109 pages, just in terms of what do you test for and how you do it, just to explain
Yeah.
how complicated things are, right? Um, but that's still on a AI assist human. If we then go
Yep.
into the extreme of agentic, where there's autonomous things, etc., 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 I would
Mm,
argue that the the frameworks aren't there yet, simply because we haven't traveled that far in the future. And I think technology is starting to become possible, but the organizational kind of brain and people haven't clicked in to what it actually means, because you need to be quite technical and see these things happening to go, oh, I didn't realize you could do that. Or, oh,
yeah.
it's real now. So you need to be quite relatively deep technical to then go, what does it mean if I have a governance function? There's just not that many people around, right? But in those frameworks, for instance, things that might be missing or things we are thinking of, and we as in the broader kind of multi-organizations I talk to, is um,
Mm,
there's still kind of decision governance, who makes decisions. And I think we should start thinking about, for instance, system governance. How do we govern
yeah.
the systems that makes decisions? Which is a completely different way of looking at things, for instance. Um,
Yeah.
in a world where you have agents across multiple organizations working together, then I think who is accountable for the algorithm that makes these agents work together? Because it crosses boundaries. So I can manage my agents, you can manage your agents, but the interactions
Mm,
between the two and how decisions are made cross boundaries, that concept doesn't hardly exist in current governance frameworks. And I have no answer to that either, for instance. So there's a few of
no.
those kind of emerging fields within governance itself.
It is almost a new layer of intermediation to allow for orchestration of agents. We used to do that as a process and an integration, data integration type question, but we now almost have it as a AI intermediation and interoperation layer with some protocols around that. And I do see emerging platforms start to specifically address that and to become, I guess, vendor agnostic around, well, I know you're going to be using tools from your current vendor set. You'll be using sort of pure play AI tools. You'll be developing your own tools and your own sort of, particular protocols. And I'll need a way to extend some kind of, interoperability between those. I think that is definitely an emerging layer. And I think see a number of the sort of, market players actively trying to shape themselves in that space. No one that I would bet my money on yet, but at least it's everyone sees the problem. That's going to we're going to go from this kind of very small potted experiments or single functional areas to much more broader interoperability between AI sort of sets across our business.
And I think therefore, because it's interoperability, once that is established, then the question is, what's the enterprise AI control layer slash software to manage the
Yeah,
interoperability? And there's
that's
software companies starting to do that as well. There's two in America that goes through a Series C, Series B, so they're
yeah.
relatively big, and there's some platform providers as well that start to think in that space. But I think that's probably more in the leading edge, in the Series B, Series C type of, I don't know, I
Mhm.
have 400 people working on that layer. Can we please help and see what works and doesn't work space? But I think that's where
Yeah,
we need to go.
yeah, I agree. I agree. John, I think that's an excellent discussion. I think we should wrap it up there. I think we've covered some really interesting discussions. We've come back to trust again. I suspect having a think about that Singaporean sort of, 104 pages on just on trust, that is such a vital element to building sort of an AI capability for the future, which I think really linked nicely to our discussion on culture as well. We're actually looking to build an experience, whether that's a citizen experience, a patient experience, or whether it's a brand experience. They're all very related to if my agents do things which are not consistent with the brand and experience and the outcomes that I'm hoping to do, then I've got a problem and I lose trust. And that's where that framework really bites. I think there were some really nice questions there, and I have some, I guess, next stage discussions around how do we drive the benefits out of our AI? What are the benefits? Are we going to be sacking lots of people, which everyone is frightened about, and rightfully so? Are we going to be getting a lot more out of the people we've got? Are we going to be able to do new things which we simply were not possible? It'd be great to just really crunch into some of those areas and see how those play out. But Jerome, thank you very much for the conversation. It was excellent. Look
Fully
forward to the
agree.
next one.
Beautiful. Thanks for having me.